I'll be talking about Edmund Burke's views of radicalism today. This is kind of one of the chief themes of the reflections on the revolution in France. And it may sometimes seem as though Burke is being a little bit old-fashioned, because indeed he was. I mean, he's a man of his times. But what I want to do is extract what we can from his comments for our own time. And so while we may disagree with, to a certain extent, his obsession with chivalry or something like that, it doesn't mean that we can't take away truths from this commentary. And probably one of the chief outcomes or themes of this commentary is the idea that civilization or order, humane order, whatever we want to call it, is like a thin veneer over the crust of a very explosive, violent, savage humanity, okay? That, as a matter of fact, a very thin veil covers up the brutality and savagery that is in most human beings. And that we would do very well not to try to break that down or try to rip that veil. So Edmund Burke is keenly aware of what human beings are capable of. And remember, he's writing this at the very beginning of the French Revolution, and he sees certain acts, one of which was the storming of the palace and the attempted kidnapping of the king and queen, who fled, but then the revolutionaries later caught up to them and captured them. And Burke treats this in a way that may at first strike you as, oh my gosh, he's, ridiculously old-fashioned. Marie Antoinette and King Louis were not great. They were very bad actual monarchs. They had allowed their people to get into a state of just utter starvation and chaos. They weren't doing very much about it. So it may seem like incredibly biased in a way. But let's just try to see why it is that he's so upset by this, right? And put aside our feelings about gender and such, because there is a vast time difference between then and now, okay? But the bigger point is, this, in his view, was the beginning of the rendering or ripping of that very thin veil. He says, for instance, that when they attacked the palace, the queen, almost naked, had to flee. Now, the queen was, as I understand it from an expert who knows these things, pretty fully clothed, actually, but didn't have on the garments of her queenly dignity, let's say, and was probably in her bedclothes and was running for her life with her children. And the royal family was running for their lives and escaping. And this in and of itself, it was a huge loss of dignity, showed an incredible lack of respect, and not just for the people, but for the institution in Burke's view. And once, people get it into their head that a particular institution is assailable, all bets are off, basically. So that's why he speaks about it being the most splendid palace in the world, and how the revolutionaries sort of debased the place, because the palace itself, as ostentatious, I've been there, like as gilded as it is, was also the accretion of advanced civilization, okay? And basically, taking a piss on advanced civilization is how he viewed this event, okay? And among the attackers were women, and he is shocked at this because one of the you may call it a mythology, but, sort of like one of the aspects of the veil or accretion of civilization was a distinction between men and women, and the idea that women were somehow purer in their motivations, or not as easily corrupted, not capable of violence. Well, these women went in with the men and tried to attack the royal family. So he says, he calls them the unutterable abomination of the furies of hell, in the abused shape of the vilest of women. And then in addition to that, They killed the king's bodyguard, stuck their heads on pikes, and when they caught up with the royal family, if I've got this right, they basically stuck the heads on pikes and paraded them down the street with their bodyguards' heads in front of them. Now, this reminds me of an event in 1916, and I bring this up even though it's disturbing, so warning, this is disturbing stuff. But in 1916 in Waco, Texas, there was this horrendous event, the lynching of Jesse Washington. Jesse Washington was by the accounts I read, mentally challenged young man who was working on a farm, who probably killed the woman that he was working for. But he had a trial that was so summary and so quick that it's not absolutely clear. But scholars looking at it say it's most likely he did, but there is some question of that maybe the husband did. But regardless of who did it, what happened was not only was Washington summarily tried within just a few hours and then sentenced within a few minutes, but he was dragged out of the courthouse by a mob. And because the telephone was in use at that time, word quickly spread, and an unbelievable crowd of between 10 and 16,000 spectators mobbed this area, and they drug him out, and they basically dropped him up and down over a fire after chopping his fingers off so he could not climb the chain, and chopping off his genitalia, and burned him slowly to death. And there were many women and many children in the audience, because it was an audience of spectators. And you can see them there, neck to neck, cramming in. There were professional photographers there to take pictures, which they then sold on postcards by the thousands to people who wanted to see it. Children not only spectated, but engaged. And some of them actually popped teeth out of the corpse's jaw after the event. So the reason why I bring this up is because the newspapers, the media, and leadership in other parts of the United States were aghast at the sheer barbarism of this, even though many, many lynchings had happened in the past. And there had been eyebrows raised and inaction and some action. But there had never been anything quite like this. And it drove home the brutality and the savagery of this in a way that galvanized people against this horrendous practice. But, you know, why was it particularly shocking? Among the main reasons that were stated by the newspapers was the participation of children, and just the sheer fact that there were thousands of people who came for nothing more than to watch somebody be slowly tortured to death. So this is an example of how even at this supposedly civilized time and place, supposedly, that right underneath that very thin veneer is utter group savagery, utter brutality, utter lack of civilization. So Burke is very much aware that once the veil is dropped on savagery, all bets are off. And in his view, even though he was watching the revolution from the beginning, when the guillotine was not actually was not being used excessively at this point, like it would be later, he could see that it was a matter of time, that the snowball was rolling. He says, all the decent drapery of life is to be rudely torn off. all the superadded ideas furnished from the wardrobe of a moral imagination, which the heart owns and the understanding ratifies as necessary to cover the defects of our naked, shivering nature and to raise it to dignity in our own estimation, are to be exploded in a situation like this as a ridiculous, absurd, and antiquated fashion. So it became, antiquated and old-fashioned to object. He says, once the spirit of a gentleman and the spirit of religion are discarded, it is difficult to put them back on. Anybody who would have said such behavior as the revolutionaries chasing the queen out of her chambers half naked or whatever was ungentlemanly, was to be laughed at, and later on to be considered definitely retrograde and worth killing. Okay. It reminds me of Thucydides' discussion of the Corsairian Revolution. He describes a very similar situation. Anybody who objected in any way and said, perhaps we shouldn't engage in this level of brutality and indecency, was considered to be part of the ideological enemy and needed to be eliminated. So coarseness and vulgarity start out seemingly as something that is an eruption that can be held under control, but it is a signal that all bets are off. And when violence happens, people tend to think that it is necessary in order to achieve good ends. That once the restrictions are off, this is the necessary condition for truly revolutionary ends. And this is where Burke has to give us pause, because he's basically saying, you may think that this is necessary and that you will achieve good ends. But the truth is, once people get out of control, all bets are off, and usually the worst things happen. So he condemns this aspect of Machiavellianism, even though poor Machiavelli is not responsible for this level of brutality and savagery. Far from it. Machiavelli was about order and authority, and believed in using violence only sparingly in order to support and reemphasize the authority of people in charge. But the Machiavellian idea that Burke objects to, or the ends justify the means, right? That the revolutionary utopia that the French so wanted justified the level of savagery that they were engaging in. So he says, for instance, the theater is a better school of moral sentiments than churches, where the feelings of humanity are outraged. There he's talking about the clerics in his own country who were promoting these revolutionary ideas and were therefore dropping their responsibility of teaching people moral restraint. He says, no theatric audience in Athens would bear what has been born in the midst of the real tragedy of this triumphal day, the day of the storming of the Palace of Versailles, a shop of horrors, so much actual crime against so much contingent advantage, right? So much advantage, imagined advantage, okay? He says this method of political computation of the means, the ends justify the means, would justify every extent of crime, and did in this situation. Burke promotes in this book toleration. Now, the French revolutionaries promoted atheism, and he very much objects to this. Anybody in their view who believed in God or who tried to defend the authority of the church was a political enemy. Burke is much more kindly towards religion, and in this quote, he shows not just the official religion of England, but religion generally, and he wants to distinguish between this sort of anything goes, it doesn't matter what you believe, and a proper tolerance. He says the tolerant think the dogmas of religion, though in different degrees, are all of moment, that is all important. And that amongst them there is, as amongst all things of value, a just ground of preference. They favor, therefore, and they tolerate. They favor their own, in other words, but they also tolerate. They tolerate not because they despise opinions, not because anything goes, but because they respect justice. They would reverently and affectionately protect all religions because they love and venerate the great principle upon which they all agree and the great object to which they are all directed. So Burke has a respect for religions generally. He thinks that they are of use to civilization in promoting restraint and a certain respect for authority, foremost God's authority, but also the authority of clerics, of people in a position to shepherd others. Here are some characteristics of extremism that Burke notes in the middle part of the reflections. He says that the revolutionaries had the spirit of a monk. That is, they had this sort of religious zeal. They had transferred from real religion to their political ideas. It was a malignant zeal, meaning that it metastasized and grew out of control. It promoted the spirit of cabal, meaning, sort of us, our tight-knit in the know group that knows the truth versus everybody else, the spirit of intrigue and proselytism, to be able to basically plot and scheme behind the scenes to attack, as well as to promote the revolutionary ideas to anybody who would listen, to gain adherents, just like in a religion. He says they carefully tried to occupy all the avenues of opinion and to have a literary monopoly. They tried to monopolize the information that people could gain. And so whenever you see somebody trying to do that in a variety of ways and trying to keep people from other types of information or convince them that they shouldn't receive other kinds of information, you've got the spirit of a cabal, a characteristic of extremism. They became a sort of demagogues, group of people, in this case of the revolutionary society in England, as well as the revolutionaries in France, who together worked as demagogues. They used the passions of the people, they whipped them up into a frenzy of anger, they rode the crest of that gigantic wave because they thought that it would gain them power. Of course, a lot of revolutionaries died along the way as they became seen as the enemies of those who were at the forefront. They promoted an unremitting industry to blacken and discredit in every way all those who did not hold to their faction. And this is probably the premier characteristic of extremism. If you're not with us, you're against us. If you're not with us, you are part of the worst possible problem. This cartoon shows us an example of this, where a Republican who, this is probably from maybe 20 years ago or so, who probably wants to end abortion somehow by overturning Roe versus Wade, okay, is equated to the Taliban. Now, I'll leave it up to you. You have your own opinions about this, but, Burke would look at this and say, okay, it may be a policy that you don't agree with and want to prevent, but is it the same as the extremism of the Taliban at that time? Okay, if not, then maybe you shouldn't equate the two, because by equating the two, you make enemies to such an extent that you can no longer work to persuade the Republican to be more moderate. He says they then proceeded, the French revolutionaries proceed in the argument as if all those who disapprove of their new abuses must of course be partisans of the old, that those who reprobate their crude and violent schemes of liberty ought to be treated as advocates for servitude, which is very much like Republicans today calling anybody who disagrees with them communists. Again, when you do this, there is no way that you're not going to make the other side more recalcitrant, more extreme. It creates polarization, which leads to an inability to compromise and an ever-increasing extremism. I think Burke and his analysis is still good for us today. We can take insights from it. We certainly are still suffering from the problem of polarizing and sometimes violent extremism.